Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for May 4th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Today, joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director for the same Texas Politics Project. We should note, I don't want to violate FERPA.
You can go ahead.
Not FERPA, HIPAA.
HIPAA.
You're not a student, you're a patient. Josh was just saying he's a little fatigued having gotten his second shot. So congratulations. And if Josh just kind of nods off, you'll know what happened.
Maybe. Have you? It depends on if they've listened to the podcast before.
Right. Well, be that as it may, today we want to talk about the results from the April 21 UT Texas Tribune Poll that's been released over the last few days. We did the last podcast on the COVID results, which was one of the multiple, things that we pulled on this time. We'll be mining this and going back to the well for a while, probably. But for today, we want to look at the multiple ways in which the poll tells us some things about the public opinion context of the legislative session currently entering its final weeks here in Texas. Now, on the off chance that you're listening to this and not from Texas or of this subculture, maybe you've been driven to this by the Eliana Plotz story in the New York Times, which is a real barn burner. Texas has a biennial legislature that meets for only 140 days every other year, hence the term biennial. And we are at we're getting close to, we're not quite at crunch time, but there are 27 days left at this recording till the legislature adjourns sine die on May 31st. We haven't started hitting the big legislative deadlines yet, but we will soon. So suffice to say that tensions are beginning to mount here. I was watching the legislature or the House right before we came on, and there were some relatively heated exchanges going on over health benefits. So we want to start the discussion. I want to start the discussion in which we do a deep dive into public attitudes on issues before the legislature by starting with a result from the poll that sets it up on an ironic or at least a kind of qualifying tone. So one of the items that we asked fairly early on in the poll for methodological reasons was whether we asked our sample of self-declared registered voters how closely they were paying attention to the legislature that was now in session. Only 10% said extremely closely. About half said not very closely at 33%, and 17% said not at all. And I kind of think that we even have to take with a grain of salt the remainder that said they were watching somewhat closely.
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretty easy question to lie on, and I like to say this is.
There's not much conscience here.
Yeah, and it says, sometimes there's a period in my life as a pollster where I might have been uncomfortable saying that, but it doesn't mean that these aren't broadly true. Ultimately, what this tells us, I think, is right? Not a ton of people are paying attention to the legislative session because really, unless you're people like us who sit here and put on the live stream during the day, and you can actually say it's part of your job, which. Maybe you can if you're listening to this, but for most, normal people outside the process, it's totally opaque. It's very confusing. But what's also true is the fact that, people are probably likely to overstate their attention.
Yeah.
Just because, you're in a political survey, you're telling us all your attitudes about the president, the governor, what have you. Say, hey, are you paying a lot of attention to the legislature? Nope.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't want to do that. So, yeah, but anyway.
That's why somewhat.
Yeah, sure, somewhat. And it did go up. It is working in the right way. And that we asked it also in March or in February. No, I think in March.
I think it was March.
Yeah, it was March.
It's February.
It was March.
It must have been March. Yeah.
No, it was March and April. And in March,
we're doing so many polls now. I can't keep track
in the
of
first
what's
quarter. It was one of those polls. In March, 44% said they were following the session either extremely or somewhat closely. It's up 6 points since then. I think, that makes sense. There's more going on, more things to grab people's attention. But again, it's a small share of the electorate who even says they're paying really close attention.
So with that as a backdrop, we asked, we then proceeded to ask people a lot of questions related to legislative policy. I really know how to set this up well. So, Judge, why don't you talk a little bit, just broadly about how we structured this, so that people have a sense of what we did.
Yeah, sure. So, essentially, the poll structure kind of follows a rather similar pattern broadly, and then some other patterns in a little bit deeper. So, the broad pattern is we ask about 15 what we call trend questions every time. We always want to know what people think the most important issues are facing the state and the country, their evaluations of the president and the governor and the lieutenant governor. More recently, we've also included in every poll evaluations of the president's and the governor's handling of COVID, because that's been so central to the last year. We ask about the direction of Texas and, their personal economic situation, things like that. And that just gives us something that we can look at every poll and see what the trends are, because we think of these as fundamental attitudes. If you take what we just said about the fact that people aren't following the legislative session that closely, that's true. What's also true is people do know what they think of the president. They do usually have a pretty good sense of what they think of the governor, and they certainly know what they think about their current economic situation and the economy, nationally and in Texas. And we also, that drives a lot of politics. So ultimately, I always thought it was funny after the 2020 election, and we're still talking about, the accuracy of the election, blah, blah, but, you see these comments from, some of Trump's supporters who would say, how could Joe Biden have won this election? I say, hey, you got hundreds of thousands of people dead from COVID. You've got an economy in the tank. How could any president of any party under that scenario win an election?
Not lose. Yes.
And that's just to set that aside. So that's why we always ask about that. Then, this is an interesting poll for us because we've increased the number of polls we're doing. So we're actually, normally we had traditionally asked in our surveys at the beginning of the session in February, and then usually around the end in June. This mid-session poll sort of requires us to think a little bit more about what we want to do in the middle. And what that kind of forces us is where if you look at our polls closely, the first poll in February was very much about broad attitudes towards, spending levels, priorities. Here we're digging in a little bit deeper now, and we're kind of still want to figure out what the priorities are. So after we ask people about their attention, we ask them in an open-ended question, what should the legislature be focusing on? And that's the entry point.
Right.
Without putting any issues before anybody, without priming anybody to think about anything, what should they be doing? Then we asked a lot of questions about COVID, which we discussed last week. And then we really had to dig into legislative proposals. And this is hard, honestly, because, the difference between the politics of policy and the actual policy itself, and the way that you map those things onto assessing public opinion is not obvious all the time. And so, what you find is that, what we essentially did was we dug into some of the policy proposals floating around in a number of areas. And so the questions are actually pretty specific, but I still think in total, you can actually pull back and take a 30,000 feet at the sum total of the questions on voting, on police reforms, on guns, on abortion, and kind of get a sense of where the electorate is broadly and specifically on some of these issues.
Yeah. So, so basically we gave people, sets of batteries of loosely related questions that were pegged to specific elements and policies that were floating around in the legislature. A lot of them we, sort of handicapped from legislation that was out there, or, debates that we know are going on. And then with some more, specific standalone items that didn't work well set in those more brief, more schematic policy idea batteries. And so we come away with, we like to think it's a fairly nuanced, set of responses that, have worked out, I think, so far more or less in terms of, a lot of the ideas that are being floating around. Inevitably, you feel like you missed some things, et cetera. And, maybe at the end we'll go, what was on your wish list? But but that kind of, gives people a sense of what we're looking at. And again, all of these results are at our website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. When you go there, there's a latest poll section that will have graphics of all this. We also have a polling archive in which we'll have an entry for this April poll, like we do for all of our other polls. in which you can get a comprehensive tab file, also access hundreds of graphics for, all of these items, or, the vast majority of the items, and by particular subgroup, and can even access the data and the data files and code books. So where do you want to start?
I just want to follow up on one thing you said there, just to be specific about something. You said, the ideas that are floating around out there. And in fact, actually, that's not exactly what we do, right? I mean, it's one of the things that we actually do is we actually go and read the legislation that's moving through committees. Or
I think I said that we look at the bills. Yeah.
No, you didn't. You said the ideas are floating around there. And I want to make clear, we don't pull every idea that's floating around out there. In fact, we specifically look at the bills to try to see. What's hard is to figure out what bills matter, what's going to advance and what's going to die. I mean, ultimately, you said, what did we not ask? But, we didn't ask about what people think about transgender kids playing sports, a bill that just actually got voted down in the Public Education Committee as of today, as I believe. So, I mean, this is what we do. So what do we find? Let's get going.
Yeah. Here. What interested you?
Well, I think we should start with just the open-ended what the legislature should be doing. We asked this question back in February, and at that point in time, COVID was still high on the list. It's driven primarily by Democrats. Republicans were starting to come back around to immigration and border security. And when I say come back around, all I mean to say is that immigration and border security is always a big issue in Texas, always a big issue for Republicans. During the Trump presidency, because of, let's just say trust in the executive branch, probably, and the seriousness with which they're taking the issue, it sort of receded a little bit. And in terms of its importance, since the Biden administration is taking back over, and since all the attention that's been paid to the influx of unaccompanied children on the border, the issue is really ramped back up in 2021. So, again, open-ended question, what should the legislature address? Top issue, immigration or border security. 36% of Texans, 61% of Republicans. And what I think was so interesting about this idea, we were talking about this earlier, was 61%, first of all, on an open-ended question is kind of amazing. I mean, it shows, just a homogeneity of attitudes. It's just apparent. We didn't give them a choice. This is just what people said. When we ask, when we look among the Democratic attitudes, it takes 5 different issues to get to 61%. And it's the 5 top Democratic issues. And, essentially it kind of speaks to the differences in the party coalitions in some ways. If you're a Republican and you're doing your business on, immigration and border security, you pretty much can go and kind of pick and choose what else you want to work on. For Democrats, 22% want the legislature to deal with COVID, 16% the energy system and the grid, 13% gun control, 11% voting rights, 9% healthcare. And so the Democrats just have a bigger plate. Is sort of
although, what's interesting about that, though, is, I mean, as I was having a conversation with somebody else this morning for an interview, and, it was David Brown on the Texas Standard, but he was making the point that, we've made, widely observed that, that question keyed people up for the Texas Legislature, which really doesn't have a lot to do in the realm of immigration and border security.
Just spend a ton of money.
Fund the hell out of it and talk about it. And, there's not a lot of action that you can really get into, making sure that undocumented people don't get government services, some kind of, attention to the state side of enforcement. But even though, it's an interesting posing of what we're seeing in the legislature right now, which is Republican legislators looking for other things to please the base on, because they can only do so much on immigration and border security. Now that's a hypothesis posing as an observation. I was
going to say,
but as we look at what we've been seeing going on in this session, it's an interesting refraction of that result. Mm-hmm. I think we typically, think, well, it's the Democrats that have this problem of their base and their constituents being scattered among all of these different interests and priorities, which is true. But because Republicans can only do a limited amount about the top priority that virtually, a huge share of their voters consistently have, that may be part of the explanation for what sets them loose on the hunt.
Yeah.
for what else they can provide in a public way to their constituents.
Yeah, I think we were talking about we're on another podcast we were recording with the Texas Tribune earlier today, and and our collaborator Professor Darren Shaw brought up the idea of issue publics, which you can more or less just think of as issue voters, the sort of people for whom who vote regularly, and there's an issue or two that really motivate their voting. And I would sort of look at this. I agree. Maybe it's a slight difference here, which is, for the Democratic coalition, it feels to me like all of these issues are important, and essentially they have to choose, which one at a given time. I think, gun control really jumped up in the most important problem, given, the mass shootings that occurred really in close proximity around when we were in the poll. But it's always an issue for Democratic voters, whether it rises to the top or not. Whereas for Republican issues, and for Republicans in Texas, the consistency of immigration and border security, to my mind, actually provides more flexibility for members, not necessarily to go looking for issues, but for looking for issue publics to please. And they exist in the Republican Party around guns in particular, which we'll get to. Abortion is another one of these sort of cultural issues. And then really, things having to do with like business and taxes. And ultimately, they can really do this almost in some ways under the radar, because as long as they're maintaining border security funding, and just waving their fist at the federal government at the same time because we're having to spend this money, well, they are doing what they're supposed to do, according to a large group of people. And then they can go kind of focus on, the people who get real intense around Republican primaries on some of these other issues.
Well, and of course, the whole, we're talking a lot about public opinion and public constituencies here. And of course, the whole mass of organized interests that populate the legislature every other year.
Oh, them.
that, actually take up most of the time.
Right.
Right. And frankly, from the perspective of the institutional, the institutional interest groups, it's a headache, or at least something of just a tactical consideration when these huge issues that aren't really about the trade groups of the organized interests or, the material interest, segments of the legislature and the lobby. It's kind of like, hey, I'm either trying to kill this. And so if they're going to spend all day on voting and I'm trying to kill legislation, that's great. Right. If I'm trying to pass something and they're going to spend all day on abortion, that's less good for me, because it's kind of chop. I got something I'm trying to get through here.
Yeah, and those things multiply, right? As the session gets as the session inevitably gets a bit nastier, as we get near the end, and, for whatever reason, partisan wins and losses, just the tension of the calendar, what have you. It seems like those things multiply. Yesterday's nasty fight makes tomorrow that much harder.
Right. And what you get is that, it's the job of the leadership to manage an inevitable kind of fragmentation that starts happening. Mm-hmm. And it's aggravated by the fact that one of the big cleavages that inevitably emerges, and we're beginning to see it now, break into slightly more, semi-public view, is the tension between the House and the Senate. So,
right.
All right. So what else do we, speaking of all these issues, so, one of the issues that's gotten national attention has been guns. So maybe we move into guns. HB 1927 is the unlicensed carry bill. In the move that surprised and we hear irritated certainly some people, that measure made it to the floor fairly intact, and then was passed to the House and sent as a little gift to the Senate, which has created headaches for Lieutenant Governor Patrick. So why don't you talk a little bit about what we know about the public opinion context of this, which is very different, and will bring us back to issue publics, I think, fairly quickly.
Right. So, generally, on a more general question, only 20% of Texas voters in April wanted to make current gun control laws less strict. So 80% of Texas voters basically wanted them more strict, left alone, or just didn't have any opinion. So it's not like there's a clamoring to loosen up the gun laws here. And the truth is, this has kind of been the case basically since Texas passed open carry. There's a pretty big desire, especially among Republicans, to loosen gun laws in the state. Once they passed open carry, we saw that opinion shift, and it hasn't really moved back at any point in time. So this is, the broad context. To the specific proposal, and how to talk about this, but ultimately the thing to know is Strong majorities of Texans support universal background checks for all gun purchases, as do strong majorities of Americans. That includes 92% of Democrats and 64% of Republicans. Constitutional carry, unlicensed carry, whatever you want to call it, is opposed by 59% of Texas voters, 34% in support. There's pretty much, majority or overwhelming opposition amongst every group except for a slight majority of Republicans. 56% support permitless carry, 39% oppose. The most sort of remarkable result in all of this is the gender gap in Republican support. So while 70% of Republican men support permitless carry, the plurality of Republican women, 49%, oppose it, with 43% in support. And so this is, not a popular policy proposal. I mean, you're talking about the whole, this is the job of leadership, is to protect people from taking tough votes. I mean, this is kind of a really good example of what we're talking about, right?
Right. And yeah, I mean, just to decompose that, I mean, again, I mean, there's a subtle point in here, I think, that can be lost, which is that we're not saying that, look, it's only like a very small handful of Republicans that want this. It's still, a pretty popular proposal among Republicans right now. It's become associated, I think, with, however you want to frame it, the Republican brand, Republican identity, ideological foundations of Republicans. But, the other side of that is that there's not a consensus, particularly, as you say, when you compare the magnitude of opposition to this among Democrats. I mean, I think something like 90% of Democrats oppose this, right?
Yeah, 85% opposed. But I mean, the other point is, would you really want to stake too much on an issue that your voters are 56-39 support oppose on?
Right. I mean, this is not something, if you're, to think about this from the pragmatic view of a candidate or incumbent looking, to run for office or to run for re-election, and you're looking for an issue that you think is a good general election issue, this isn't one of them. But if you're looking to run in a primary, it's still not the best for a primary, but what your position is going to have to be if you are going to run in a Republican primary, which is you're going to be inclined to toe the line on this.
Yeah. I mean, I have you can apply this to a number of the issues that we kind of looked at in this poll, but you're not going to have a lot of success as a Republican elected official going back to your primary voters and saying, I went to the legislature this year and I didn't, make gun control laws here more strict. So you guys should reelect me. I didn't loosen up, I made sure that abortion laws didn't get any looser in Texas. It's like, well, there's someone who wants to make them stricter.
Right.
And so they're there to run in the primary.
Yeah, I think that's right. Context is everything in that, because if, all things being equal, you could imagine a universe in which that would be sufficient.
I can imagine.
Right. I mean, in other words, if you look at the laws in Texas and you look at a state in which it's already pretty difficult to get an abortion, and a state in which you can open carry, the barriers for licensed carry have been decreasing. It's, saying, look, this, I'm proud of what Texas is, and I held the line. It's intuitively not a terrible position, but unless you know that the environment is what it is in Texas, that there are people for whom, in those two issue examples are very important, and it's not going to be good enough for them, and they will go and they will make you look like it's not enough. Make it look like it's not enough. In a primary election in which turnout is, well less than half.
Yeah, it's minuscule.
In a very homogenous Republican district, which many of them are, and they will be even more so after the next redistricting round. You set up a dynamic that that this is the mechanism by which, the system gets, more ideologically sorted within the parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's one of the values of that comes out of this. But when you're in the session of, when you're in the legislative session, it poses problems for, managing these kinds of issues when they come up. Mm-hmm. So another issue.
Well, let's just jump through abortion then, I guess, since we just touched on it.
Let's just jump through
abortion. Is that what people do? Anyway. So, when it comes to abortion, we tested 3 of the proposals making their way through the legislature: outlawing abortion after 6 weeks, allowing anyone in Texas the right to sue an abortion provider they perceive to be violating state law, and then banning abortion if the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, which is sort of out there in the ether as a possibility.
And has been talked about for a long time. And again, something that was seen. I mean, I remember people being worried this might pass about 10 years ago, but, the so-called trigger bill.
Right. And so, what we find with the results of these is kind of, I would say what we generally tend to find with abortion attitudes, and really no matter how we ask about them. And this is something to say, we said it before about like nobody's following the legislature as an example. Abortion is not like that. Not that people are following abortion policy, but people know what they think about abortion. It's not like all of a sudden like something's going to happen and someone's going to flip on their view on abortion. It really doesn't work that way. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It reinforces itself across, culture, party, religion. There's just a lot of other reasons. Anyway, the two sort of, I would say restrictions versus the banning, right? Outlawing abortion after 6 weeks, allowing someone to sue an abortion provider are basically controversial, but more popular than unpopular. But neither of them receive the support of a majority of voters. 49% of Texans would outlaw abortion after 6 weeks. 41% would oppose that. 44% would allow anyone in Texas the right to sue an abortion provider, which I'll just put parentheses here, I think is one of the craziest policy ideas I've ever heard. 37% oppose it.
Yeah, I'm wondering where Texans for Lawsuit Reform is on this.
Yeah, I mean...
Wait, I'm listening. What do I hear? Oh, wait, you know what I hear? Those are crickets, Josh.
Oh, okay.
Those are crickets in the TLR building over this abortion bill.
Yeah, well, anyway, whatever legal standing means, I don't know. Anyway, but apparently neither do the lawyers in the legislature. So, and then the last one, so those are, again, broadly acceptable to voters. Obviously, much more Republicans than Democrats. 74% of Republicans support the 6-week ban. 66% support allowing anyone to sue an abortion provider. But when it comes to the trigger bill, a majority of voters, 54%, oppose it. Again, this is pretty common. When we ask, the quote unquote standard abortion question that you find in academic literature, just kind of get one question on abortion. The position of banning abortion completely in all circumstances is really only selected by about 12 to 16% of Texas voters. It might, and among Republicans, it's usually about 18 to 20%. So 1 in 5, give or take, Texas Republicans are usually in support of completely banning the procedure. And this is, it's like a lot of things where, you start talking about little tweaks around the edges, potential restrictions, another hurdle or thing, to jump over. A lot of people say that's okay.
I think we should say comparatively, what can be marketed as comparatively small tweaks. They are not experienced as tweaks by all
no, you're absolutely right. You're right. I should be more careful. But what can be described as, what I like to say is, what people who
can be framed as, let's just call it what it is. I mean,
I was going to say, the framing that I think is most often used that I hate is the one of, this is common sense, where common sense means, whatever I think you should do is common sense. But generally, if a lot of people can see something as common sense, like, for example, a good example of this would be like, parental notification requirements for minors. There's going to be a lot of Democrats who are going to say, I think, a minor who wants to get an abortion, you probably should get the parents involved, right? Things like that generally are not, if not overwhelmingly popular, are more popular than not. Removing access as opposed to limiting access or making it more difficult is another question entirely. And so even though a majority of Republicans support this, it's 58% versus 29% who oppose it. Actually look kind of a lot like permitless carry in some ways, almost, a little bit more opposition to permitless carry actually. But large majorities of other groups opposing this. And, again, I think this is kind of common. So the question becomes, is it worth it? Right.
Yeah. And I think, the experiments that we're seeing here with different, where, it's kind of a search for the boundary on these proposals. You were mentioning, the slim number of people, it's really in the teens that in the standard abortion question would sign off on banning abortion outright in all circumstances. But if you look at then the trigger bill, you throw overturning Roe v. Wade into the mix. I think of it almost as like a stimulus, just to see, okay, so what can you do to support? The support for that was at 34%. right? So you pick up some independents. You don't really pick up very many Democrats, but that's an interesting piece in terms of like where, and I think that's what we see in a lot of, you see it with guns, you see it with abortion. We've talked about it before. You see it even to some degree with some of the policing stuff, not quite as clearly, but it's a matter of where can you find a spot where people will allow some slippage,
Mm-hmm.
In what are otherwise seem like pretty set attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We see it in immigration, right? We see it in a lot of areas of, where we expect otherwise polarized results.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to come down to the end here. What else? What else you want to give pride of place? I mean, we did this in the Tribune podcast, but, you had to consider what everyone else was doing. What else would you say from the, within the realm of the legislative stuff you found really interesting?
I think, the questions we asked on Medicaid expansion were really interesting. And I think partially because maybe, I probably had internalized a view of the politics of this a little too much. And I'm happy to admit when I'm wrong. And you look at this and it was sort of a surprising result. So we asked two questions about it. First, we basically asked, what we call salience question. How much have you heard about basically, Texas' decision not to expand Medicaid eligibility to more people? We explained what Medicaid is, who it serves. And this is and what we found was kind of similar to the legislature. Only 10% of people said that they've heard a lot about this. And this is despite the fact that, we've had a decades-long plus discussion over Texas's large uninsured population, nation-leading uninsured population, about Texas's decision not to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, despite, again, this, large, low socioeconomic status, uninsured population in the state. And, and I remember, I started here working with you about 10 years ago. And, the Rick Perry years, it was very common to sort of hear Medicaid talked about as, a failed program, an unfunded mandate, something that would bankrupt the state if we let it, et cetera, et cetera. And so you'd think, that the idea of even talking about Medicaid was impossible. And yet when we asked then on the follow-up, would you support expanding eligibility for Medicaid? A majority of Texans, 55%, would support it, 26% oppose it. The remaining about 20% don't know or don't have an opinion on it. But what was most surprising to me was that, while 41% of Republicans oppose Medicaid expansion, a plurality, 32% were supportive of it, which I think kind of goes against this notion, in Texas in particular, that Medicaid is just untouchable.
Dead on arrival.
Yeah, dead on arrival. And there are reasons why. Honestly, there are budget reasons why I think, there's more actual legitimate concern about Medicaid expansion in Texas than, I think even proponents of it give credit for. But the idea that like this can't move because, Republican opposition to it is overwhelming is kind of wrong. It looks like. Now, if a real debate started on this and both sides mobilized and started making, the claims that they've made in the past about, the pros and cons of this, I'm not sure that, Republicans wouldn't polarize to the Republican position and Democrats likewise. But it's interesting nonetheless, after a year of COVID in which, these sort of the medical system in Texas has been put on full display for Texans, that there's support here. And I'll add to this something I said to you, which was, when we ask about a universal system versus the current
I was
system,
just thinking about that. Yeah.
We also find slight majority support for the universal system. And so what's interesting about all that is just, I think, there's certainly something under the surface here, if not at the top, it may not even be under the surface, about Texans' dissatisfaction with the current options for healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it strikes me as something. It's another one of those things that I use, a questionable metaphor, but nonetheless, I'll use it anyway. But it's one of those things where, it's there. How deep are the roots cognitively? I'm not sure, because it seems like, you can detect that in the ways that you're talking about, right. But it's also easily yanked out and, or, refactors where the metaphor breaks down. But, it's easy to kind of overwhelm that with something else. So people are thinking, this experience of healthcare is really not very good. I have had I'm not happy with this. But then, socialism, Obamacare. And well, yeah, I'd like it to be better, but I certainly don't want socialism. Right. And so, it's just easy. It's there, but I get the sense it's one of those things that's easily redirected, reframed. I think for me is thinking about this, and then we can wind up pretty quickly. But the police numbers I think were very interesting, given this is obviously so connected to other things that are going on that are important right now. Obviously, the discussion of race. We've talked about how if you think about the police, if you ask about the police in the context of the death of Black Americans in the custody of police, you get highly polarized responses. Obviously sort of activated by the discussion of race in the context of policing. But I was struck by how much support there was otherwise in this poll for some of the police reforms that are on the table in the George Floyd Act, including among Republicans. Banning, we asked about banning chokeholds. We asked about duty to intervene laws. And we found, a lot of support, including substantial support among Republicans and conservatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
which I think, to hear the debate, and we talked about this in the last podcast, we had to rehearse it, but to hear the kind of rhetoric suggesting that you owe absolutely unconditional support to the police and to grant them, unlimited latitude is actually not a characterization of what's out there, a fair characterization of what's out there.
Yeah, I think the best way to link those things together, and I hadn't really thought about it until earlier today, but, as you said, when asking about the deaths of Black Americans at the hands of police, 82% of Republicans say that they're isolated incidents as opposed to 87% of Democrats who see them as broader problems. But what's really, consistent about this, and I say this almost like I almost want to say it's nice, but I said, same public opinion, consistency is not a requirement for people's attitudes.
Which is a good thing.
Trust me. But, the most popular proposal we tested was requiring an officer to intervene when another one is misusing force. And I think, if you, whether you believe that, these deaths are, a sign of systematic racism or they're isolated incidents, this is something that, everyone should be able to get behind, and they do. And I think that's nice. So what it shows you is that, there is a sense that, at least among Republicans, that, there is a certain pocket who definitely doesn't want to place any sort of restrictions on police officers, but it's also coming from the belief that that basically the vast majority of police officers are doing well. And if you just give them a couple more rules, it'll take care of the bad ones.
Yeah, obligate people to, if you will, police themselves. It's interesting to pose that in terms of consistency because, it's not entirely consistent.
No,
but it does help smooth off the rough edges of what might be, a lack of fit between accumulating evidence and some pre-existing beliefs about this.
Can I add one more thing before we wrap up? I know we're running long. Come on, boss, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
The other thing this poll, and it's one of the things, it's not just in this poll, but you can see it because of the number of polls we conduct both this year and over time. It's a lot. I think we've done over 40 surveys over the last 10 years of Texans' attitudes. But, the other thing that was really notable in this poll, and it's related to the legislative session, is, Greg Abbott's net approval has declined from plus 24, so it's 56 approving, 32 disapproving, so plus 24 at the start of the pandemic last April to minus 2 in this poll. Among Republicans, it's dropped from plus 82 to plus 64. And among Democrats, it's gone from minus 35 to minus 76. Similar pattern with his handling of COVID. I think the COVID is really what has driven down. Greg Abbott could regularly, I think, up until recently, not rely on, but count on, let's say, the support of somewhere between 15 and 25, 30% of Democrats, depending on what just happened, the moment we're in, time, not necessarily to vote for him, but certainly to approve of the job he's doing. Some of them certainly did vote for him, probably. What's interesting now is that Greg Abbott looks like as polarizing of a politician as anybody. You've got 83% of Democrats disapproving of the job he's doing, 88% of Republicans approving. And so that's a pretty big shift. There's been a less of a shift among the other elected officials. Patrick saw a much smaller decline from plus 4 to minus 4, plus 60 among Republicans to plus 53, minus 55 among Democrats to minus 70. So he also has seen a little bit of a dip through all this.
He had less far to fall.
Well,
Patrick was not, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, he had less far to fall. He's less well known. He's also not the face of the party and the pandemic response in the state.
Yeah.
And I'm not sitting here, I'm not passing judgment on Abbott's response either way, But I would think it's not surprising to see a governor who's been the lead figure in the state's response to a massive pandemic that's claimed 50,000 lives, related economic fallout from all that. It's not surprising to see him taking some hits at this point after a year of this.
Yeah, I think that's, this has been an ongoing trend, I think, for him. I mean, if you look at the trend lines, which you can see at our website, you can see this happening pretty clearly in the trend graphics that we've produced there. And
the real shift among Democrats, again, we can never know for sure, just to be all sciencey for a second. We don't know anything for sure, but just to be sciencey. But I think the real shift comes after the opening of the state, the removal of the mask mandates and the opening of the businesses, which were extremely polarizing decisions between Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
And then after that, you see the Democratic evaluations drop.
Yeah. I mean, I think you see it. There's a couple of little drop-offs among Democrats, I think. On that note, thanks for listening. Thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent technical staff in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to you for listening. Again, we rolled out all the support material and lots of elaboration of these results at our website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Look in the poll archive, look in the latest poll section, and check out the blog. We'll have more drill down into this in coming days and weeks. Thanks again for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.